Jing Li stood at the edge of the small clearing, staring into the dense forest ahead. The safe house was no longer safe. They had stayed long enough to train, to gather what little information they could. But now, the enemy was closing in. The time for hiding was over. Li Chang and Liu Mei joined him, both wearing determined expressions. "Are you ready?" Liu Mei asked, her voice low but steady. She knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. The tension was thick in the air, and Jing Li could feel it in his chest. He nodded, though his heart was racing. He wasn't sure if he was truly ready, but he had no choice. "Let's end this." The group moved quickly through the forest, each step bringing them closer to the final confrontation. They had no idea how many enemies they were up against, but they knew they were outnumbered. The only advantage they had was the power of the scroll, and even that was a double-edged sword. As they neared a small clearing, they saw them. The enemy was waiting, hidden in the shadows, their faces obscured by hoods and masks. Jing Li's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the scroll's power stirring inside him, as if it recognized the danger ahead. Li Chang stepped forward first, his voice calm but firm. "We're not here to fight you. We just want the scroll." A dark figure in the back of the group stepped forward. The man's voice was cold and harsh. "The scroll belongs to us. You can't stop what's already been set in motion." Jing Li's hands trembled as he gripped the scroll tightly. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he could feel the tension in the air. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to face whatever came next. Liu Mei, standing beside him, whispered, "Don't let them take it. We've come too far." The enemy leader raised his hand, signaling for the attack. In an instant, the clearing erupted into chaos. Jing Li's heart raced as the first wave of enemies charged toward them, weapons drawn. He barely had time to react before Li Chang moved in, skillfully taking down several attackers with ease. Liu Mei, too, was quick, her movements fluid as she fought off enemies left and right. But Jing Li, despite his newfound strength from the scroll, felt overwhelmed. He could feel the power surging inside him, but it was unpredictable. One moment, he felt strong, the next, he was exhausted and drained. It was clear he still didn't have full control over the power he had unlocked. The leader of the enemy group charged forward, aiming directly for Jing Li. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. He had to use the scroll's power to fight back, to protect himself and the people he had come to trust. He focused, trying to summon the energy within him. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a burst of energy exploded from the scroll, knocking the enemy leader back. Jing Li fell to his knees, the power draining him, but the enemy leader was down. The battle was not over, but it had shifted in their favor. Li Chang and Liu Mei continued to fight off the remaining enemies, but Jing Li knew they were running out of time. They had to end this quickly. He struggled to his feet, trying to catch his breath. "Let's finish this," he said, determination in his voice. With one final, powerful push, they managed to defeat the rest of the enemies, their attackers falling one by one. Jing Li stood among the bodies, exhausted and breathing heavily, but victorious. Li Chang clapped him on the back. "You did it. You controlled the power. For now, at least." Jing Li didn't respond. His mind was already racing, thinking of what would come next. This battle was won, but there was still so much more to uncover, so much more danger ahead. The scroll's power had shown its strength, but was it enough to protect him from everything that was coming? He looked at Liu Mei and Li Chang, both of them standing by his side, ready for whatever came next. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. The aftermath of the battle left Jing Li feeling both victorious and exhausted. The enemies they had fought were strong, but the power of the scroll had proven to be more powerful. However, Jing Li knew that this was only one step in a much larger conflict. The enemies they had defeated were just a small part of something much bigger, and the real challenge was still ahead. As they made their way back to the safe house, Li Chang and Liu Mei were quiet, both lost in their thoughts. Jing Li felt a sense of relief, but also the weight of the scroll's power. The more he used it, the more he felt like it was changing him. It was as if the power was becoming part of him, and with that came a sense of responsibility he didn't fully understand. Liu Mei broke the silence. "We won today, but this war is far from over. The people after you won't stop. They'll come for the scroll, and they won't stop until they have it. Jing Li looked at her, his mind racing. He had always known that the scroll was important, but now he realized just how dangerous it was. The enemies weren't just looking for a treasure, they were seeking control over something far more powerful. "What do we do next?" Jing Li asked, his voice weary. Li Chang looked at him, his expression serious. "We need to find out who's really behind this. The people after you are just pawns in a much bigger game. If we don't stop them now, they'll only grow stronger." The urgency in Li Cheng's voice wasn't lost on Jing Lai. He knew that the scroll's power was something that had to be protected, but who could they trust in a world full of enemies? The next few days were spent in preparation. They studied the ancient book further, learning more about the scroll's history and the enemies they were up against. As Jing Li trained, he could feel the power growing inside him, and with it, a deeper understanding of what he had to do. But even as they prepared, Jing Li couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the enemies they were being watched. There were signs, small things that didn't add up, that told him their enemies were getting closer, and they were more powerful than they realized. Lu Mei came to him one evening, her face troubled. "We've been compromised," she said quietly. "The enemy has infiltrated the city. They know where we are." Jing Lai's heart sank. They had been careful, but now it seemed like their time was running out. "What do we do now?" he asked, his mind racing for answers. Li Cheng stepped forward, his face grim. "We fight. But this time, we'll need to be smarter. The enemies are too powerful to face head-on without a plan." They gathered their things, prepared for the battle ahead. Jing Li knew that the real fight was just beginning. The power of the scroll wasn't just a gift, it was a curse, and now it was up to him to decide how to use it. Jing Li stood in the middle of the empty street, the weight of the scroll heavy in his hands. The night was still, and for a moment it seemed like the calm before a storm. He knew the enemy was close, but he didn't know exactly when or where they would strike. His heart raced, but his mind was sharp. He had come a long way since discovering the scroll, and now he was about to face the consequences of wielding such power. Li Cheng and Lu Mei were at his side, both alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings. They had been careful, staying in the shadows and moving quickly, but they knew it was only a matter of time before the enemies caught up with them. Jing Lai felt the power of the scroll surging inside him, but he also knew that it was a double-edged sword. The more he used it, the harder it became to control. "They're coming," Lu Mei whispered, her voice tense. Jing Li didn't need to ask how she knew. He could feel it too. The air was thick with danger. He looked at Li Cheng, who nodded and motioned for them to move. They quickly slipped into an alleyway, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps of their pursuers echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Suddenly, the enemy appeared, surrounding them from all sides. Jing Lai's heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the scroll, but before he could react, a powerful force knocked him to the ground. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. It felt like the world was spinning out of control. "You can't escape," a voice taunted from the shadows. "The scroll belongs to us, and we'll do whatever it takes to get it back." Jing Li struggled to regain his composure, but he knew this wasn't just any enemy. These were the people who had been hunting him for so long, and they had the strength and numbers to overwhelm him. But he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Li Cheng stepped forward, his expression cold. "We won't let you take it," he said, his voice full of determination. With a single command, the battle began. Jing Li scrambled to his feet, the power of the scroll building inside him. He could feel the energy pulsing stronger than ever before, but he also felt the danger of losing control. Every time he used it, it took a toll on his body and mind. Still, he couldn't let the enemies win. The fight was intense, with both sides giving their all. Jing Lai fought with everything he had, using the power of the scroll to deflect attacks and strike back. He could feel the energy flowing through him, guiding his movements. But it wasn't enough. The enemy was relentless, and soon, Jing Lai found himself struggling to keep up. Suddenly, Lu Mei stepped in, her swift movements cutting through the chaos. "Jing Lai, focus," she shouted. "You can control it. Trust yourself." Her words sparked something inside him. Jing Lai took a deep breath, pushing aside his fear. He focused on the scroll, willing the power to flow through him with precision. For the first time, he felt a sense of control. The energy surged within him, but this time, he directed it with purpose. With a single motion, he unleashed a powerful burst of energy, sending the enemies flying back. The battle came to a sudden halt. The remaining enemies stared at him in disbelief. Jing Li stood tall, his body trembling from the strain, but his determination unwavering. "This is not over," he said, his voice steady. "But it's a warning. You won't take the scroll." The enemies hesitated, but it was clear they understood the message. They slowly retreated into the shadows, leaving Jing Li and his friends standing victorious but exhausted. As the dust settled, Jing Li looked at Li Cheng and Lu Mei. We've won this battle, but the war is far from over. Li Cheng nodded. We need to keep moving. They'll be back, and we need to be ready. Jing Li clenched the scroll tightly, knowing that the hardest challenges were still ahead. But for the first time, he felt like he had a chance. He wasn't alone in this fight, and with his friends by his side, they could face whatever came next. The quiet after the battle was almost eerie. Jing Li stood in the middle of the street, the scroll still clutched in his hand. His body was sore, and his mind was reeling from the fierce fight they had just endured. The power of the scroll had grown stronger, but so had the enemies. It seemed like they would never stop coming, and Jing Li knew that every victory was only temporary. The real war had just... Li Cheng and Lu Mei were both catching their breath, looking around cautiously. The sounds of retreating footsteps echoed in the distance, and the tension in the air was palpable. They had narrowly escaped, but they knew the enemies wouldn't give up easily. They'll be back, Li Cheng muttered, his eyes narrowing. We can't stay here for long. Jing Li nodded, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The scroll was a powerful weapon, but it was also a beacon for enemies. He couldn't keep running forever. They needed a plan, a way to finally end this cycle of battles and attacks. Where do we go now? Lu Mei asked, breaking the silence. Jing Li turned to her, his expression serious. We need to find out who's behind all of this. Who's controlling these enemies? If we don't stop them at the source, this will never end. Li Cheng agreed. But we can't rush in blindly. We need to gather more information. If we're going to win, we have to be smarter. They spent the next few days in a quiet town on the outskirts of the city, gathering supplies and information. Jing Li focused on controlling the power of the scroll, pushing himself to learn more about it. The more he used it, the more he understood how unpredictable it could be. But he also realized that, with practice, he could learn to control it better. One evening, while they were discussing their next move, a stranger appeared at their door. He was tall, wearing a long cloak that concealed his features. His voice was calm, yet carried a sense of authority. I know what you're looking for, the stranger said, his eyes glinting in the dim light, and I can help you find it. Jing Li and his friends exchanged wary glances. They had learned the hard way not to trust anyone too easily. Who are you? Lu Mei asked, her hand ready on her weapon. The stranger smiled faintly. Let's just say I'm someone who's been watching your progress, and I have information that can help you defeat your enemies. But it comes at a price. Jing Li hesitated. He didn't like the idea of relying on someone else, especially someone who appeared out of nowhere. But the stranger seemed to know things they didn't, and that could be the edge they needed. What do you want in return? Jing Li asked, his voice steady. The stranger's smile widened. I want the scroll. Jing Li's grip on the scroll tightened. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. Why do you want the scroll? The stranger's eyes grew serious. Because it's not just a weapon. It's the key to something much bigger. Something you don't fully understand yet. Jing Li was torn. He needed information, but he wasn't sure if he could trust this person. He had seen how dangerous the scroll could be, but it was also their only hope. Giving it up seemed impossible. I can't give you the scroll, Jing Li said, shaking his head. Not without knowing who you are and what you really want with it. The stranger looked disappointed but didn't press further. Very well, he said. But remember, the enemies you're facing are only part of a much larger game. If you want to survive, you'll need to understand the bigger picture. With that, the stranger turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Jing Li and his friends with more questions than answers. As the days passed, Jing Li found himself increasingly distracted by the stranger's words. The enemy wasn't just after the scroll, they were after something bigger. But what was it? And why did the stranger think the scroll was the key? Jing Li knew one thing for sure: they couldn't afford to waste any more time. The enemies were out there, and they were getting closer. It was time to take the fight to them. Jing Li and his team knew they couldn't stay in the quiet town forever. After their encounter with the mysterious stranger, they were more determined than ever to get answers. The stranger's words had left them with many questions, especially about the true power of the scroll and what the enemies were really after. They decided to move forward and track down the people behind the attacks. But the more they investigated, the more dangerous things became. Jing Li felt like they were being watched constantly, and the enemies were getting closer. It was clear that they were not just ordinary enemies, they were part of a much larger network with far-reaching influence. As Jing Li focused on controlling the scroll, he discovered more about its power. It was not just a weapon, it was something that could change the balance of power in the entire world. The more he used it, the more he realized that whoever controlled the scroll controlled the fate of many. The thought terrified him, but it also pushed him to keep fighting. The team continued their journey, trying to stay one step ahead of their enemies. Along the way, they encountered old allies and new enemies, all of whom seemed to be after the scroll. Each confrontation was more dangerous than the last, and Jing Li began to realize that the true battle wasn't just about the scroll, it was about survival. At one point, they were ambushed by a group of skilled fighters who seemed to know their every move. The battle was fierce, but Jing Li's determination and the power of the scroll helped them escape, though not without consequences. They were forced to retreat and regroup, but Jing Li knew that the time to confront their enemies was fast approaching. In the aftermath of the fight, Jing Li couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. The enemies were always one step ahead, and it seemed like they were being guided toward a final confrontation. Jing Li and his team had no choice but to continue their journey, but the question of who was truly pulling the strings haunted him. They knew that the stakes were higher than ever, and their next move could be the one that changed everything. Jing Li and his team had made it through countless battles, but the true enemy was still elusive. They were close to discovering who was behind the attacks, but with every step they took, it felt like the walls were closing in on them. It was becoming more obvious that the enemies weren't just random groups, they were part of a larger, more organized force. This realization made them even more determined to find the truth, but also more vulnerable. As they traveled, Jing Li began to experience strange occurrences with the scroll. It seemed to react differently each time he used it. At first, it was just a tool for combat, but now it felt like it was trying to communicate with him in ways he didn't understand. The scroll was more than just a powerful weapon, it was connected to something deeper, something ancient. The group found themselves in a dangerous situation when they were ambushed once again. This time, the attackers were different. They were faster, stronger, and seemed to know their every move. The battle was intense, and Jing Li was pushed to the edge of his limits. Despite the odds, they managed to escape, but not without sustaining injuries. In the aftermath of the attack, Jing Li grew even more suspicious about the true nature of their enemies. It wasn't just about the scroll anymore. The people after them were part of a bigger plan, and they were determined to stop Jing Li at any cost. The weight of their mission was beginning to take its toll on him, but he couldn't stop now. They decided to seek out the last known location of an ancient group that had been rumored to hold the key to stopping the enemies. But the closer they got to their destination, the more dangerous their journey became. The group's movements were being tracked, and it was only a matter of time before the enemy closed in on them for a final confrontation. Jing Li knew the time was running out. The final battle was approaching, and they had to be ready. But with the scroll's power growing uncontrollably and their enemies closing in, the future seemed uncertain. One thing was clear: the fight ahead would determine everything. Jing Li and his team find themselves at the final stage of their journey, where the stakes are higher than ever. Their enemies have grown stronger and more organized, and the dangers they face are now more deadly than before. With every passing day, Jing Li feels the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders, knowing that the fate of many depends on the success of their mission. The team arrives at a hidden location where they believe the final confrontation with the enemy is inevitable. However, the closer they get, the more they realize how deeply the enemies have infiltrated every part of their world. Jing Li's suspicions grow as he notices signs that they are being watched, and it becomes clear that their every move is being anticipated. As tensions rise, the team faces a series of increasingly dangerous ambushes. Each battle tests their limits, and Jing Li, in particular, is pushed to the edge. His connection to the scroll is stronger than ever, but so is the fear that comes with it. The scroll is powerful, but Jing Li begins to feel like he is losing control of it. He wonders if it is guiding him toward a greater destiny, or if it's simply a weapon that will ultimately bring destruction. The situation becomes even more complicated when they uncover a shocking truth: their enemies are not just after the scroll, but they have been searching for it for centuries. This realization shakes Jing Li to his core, as he realizes that the scroll is part of a much larger, ancient plan. The people after them are not just random foes, they are the remnants of an old, powerful group determined to take control of the world. Jing Li and his team are left with no choice but to confront these enemies head-on. The chapter ends with the team preparing for their most dangerous battle yet, knowing that the outcome will decide everything. The tension is palpable, and the uncertainty of the future looms large. The final battle is approaching, and Jing Li must face not only the enemies but also the true power of the scroll. The tension reaches its peak as Jing Li and his team prepare for the final showdown with their enemies. They've come so far, and now everything is at stake. The journey that started with the discovery of the scroll has led them here, to a point where the balance of power in the world hangs by a thread. Jing Li knows that the enemies they face are not just after the scroll, they are after domination and control, and they will stop at nothing to achieve their goal. As Jing Li and his team continue their preparations, they are confronted with overwhelming odds. The enemies, who have been chasing them throughout their journey, seem to be closing in from all sides. With each encounter, the battles get fiercer, and it becomes clear that Jing Li's group is the last line of defense standing between the world and total chaos. The scroll's power is both a blessing and a curse, and Jing Li must now decide whether to fully embrace its power or risk losing control. During the chapter, the team uncovers more about their enemies' true intentions. It turns out that the group they are facing is not just a random faction, but an ancient organization that has been pulling the strings for centuries. They have been searching for the scroll for a long time, knowing that whoever controls it can reshape the world according to their will. The scroll, with its unimaginable power, holds the key to this world-changing event, and it's clear that Jing Li is the only one who can